Hello everybody, and welcome back to video 3 of my 5-part video series where I break down the results of my PhD and make them more accessible to everyone in esports. Video 1, we looked at kind of what is stress. Video 2, we looked at the sources of stress, so stressors experienced by competitive and elite esports athletes. And in video 3, we're going to look at the whole stress and coping process in esports athletes. Let's jump in. Disclaimer, I've said this disclaimer at the start of every video, and I will continue to do it throughout the rest of the video series. I'm not a registered psychologist. The content of this video shouldn't be used instead of seeking professional help. If you're struggling, please reach out. Don't suffer in silence. So this was the second study of my PhD, and it was this is a mouthful, I'm sorry. It was a longitudinal analysis of the stresses, stress, coping, and coping effectiveness in elite esports athletes. So if that doesn't make any sense to you, what are all those words? You need to go back and watch video 1. Video 1, I break down what is stress in esports. So the aim of study 2, you may have noticed in the last video, I put this up and I said, we're going to look at just at influencing factors. This was one of the biggest studies I ran in my PhD because we looked at the whole process. So video 1, where I explained stresses, primary appraisal, secondary appraisal, coping effectiveness. This study looked at the whole process longitudinally, and I'll explain what that means in the methods slide. So a real quick overview. I'm going to breeze through this overview because some of you who have watched video 1 will be going, we know what stresses are. We know what stress appraisal is because you told us in video 1 and you broke that all down. A really quick recap. When something happens in our performance environment, we go through primary appraisal. How intense is it? How much control do I have over it? Is it a threat or a challenge? At the same time, we're going through secondary appraisal. How many resources do I perceive that I have to overcome that stressor? When they are in alignment, when we think that the external stressor will tax our internal resources or exceed our internal resources, that's when we feel stressed. And when we feel stressed, we implement a coping strategy. And we talked about 3 different higher order coping strategies in video 1. Problem-focused coping, things that alter the source of stress itself. Emotion-focused coping, strategies that help us deal with our internal state and our internal response to stresses. And avoidance coping, which can be good in small doses, but is not good with long-term use, which is physical and cognitive efforts to disengage from the stressor. And today, I didn't cover this very well in video 1, but today we're also going to talk about coping effectiveness. So it's all well and good to implement a coping strategy, but how effective is that coping strategy? And as you'll see by that line, going from outcomes or coping effectiveness all the way back around to primary appraisal, the effectiveness of that coping strategy is determined by how well that coping strategy or a combination of coping strategies are successful in alleviating stress. And think about that. If we implement a problem-focused coping strategy, we change the source of stress, we should lower the primary appraisal value that we've given it, bringing it more in line with or below our secondary resources, removing or at least limiting the stress response. In the same way, if we implement an emotion-focused coping strategy, that could lower the intensity of the perception of stress, improving our performance and improving our mental health in esports. That's what that line coming from outcomes to primary appraisal is referring to. If our coping is effective, it impacts the appraisal process and lessens our stress response. So, who were the people who were in my second study? Well, we followed, that sounds a bit creepy, we surveyed over 87 days, 6 elite male League of Legends players. So we followed players competing in the Oceanic Challenger Series. If you remember what that used to be, then you've been in the esports industry for 2 years at least. It's really sad that got changed, but the LCO is absolutely fantastic. I loved the OCS. All of the players that we followed from various teams, their teams finished in the top 6. So our results include general series and final series stress and coping results. How did we do this? So how did we, survey them? Well, 3 times a week. So 3 diaries, stress and coping diaries, were completed each week. After 1 solo training, after 1 team training, and after 1 competitive match, players had to fill out a stress diary each week. This was over that 87-day period. In each diary, so there's a lot of work for the participants, and I'm so grateful for everything these participants gave me. They know who they are. They know how grateful I am over this 87-day period. Each diary collected what's causing you stress. List them all. How are you appraising all of those stresses? How are you coping with all of those stresses? And how effective was it? These are the study results. And before I get into them, what I want you to take away from these results is that this is what elite players are doing. This is how elite players are coping with their stress. So if you're a competitive e-athlete and you're going, teammate performance is absolutely killing me, or teammate mistake, and if they don't make sense to you, go watch video 2, go through the sources of stress. Antisocial behavior is absolutely killing me. Try to employ some of these coping strategies that these elite e-athletes have employed. So what did we find? This is going to be very important for players and support staff, these results. 55% of the lower order stresses, video 2 explained the difference between lower and higher order stresses by my categorization. 55% of the lower order stresses were made up by general performance, outcome. So did we win or did we lose? Critical moment performance, so clutch, and teammate mistake. Now this is really interesting because it supports what we found in study 1. We looked at an elite sample here in organized teams, and you'll notice that in the lower order stresses, teammate is less reported. So that's very interesting. If you're a player, manager, sports psychologist, org owner, team manager, support staff in general, know that if you're working with an elite team, it's more likely that their stresses are related to their performance and help them better overcome those stresses. At a higher order coping, again, supporting study 1, performance and teammate stresses combined accounted for 80% or 79% of all the stresses reported. So this supports study 1. It also supports the traditional sports stress and coping literature for all of you traditional sports psychologists who are listening, in that a small number of stresses accounted for the majority of stresses experienced by all e-athletes. It's really important that we know that, and it's really important that we target our help where it's going to make the most difference. Appraisals. Now, this was interesting. We didn't actually find too much here, but the small thing we did find was quite interesting. 50% challenge or threat perception. What this means is that we don't really know what is determining challenge or threat appraisals. And if you've forgotten what they are, a threat appraisal is when you look at the stressor in your performance environment and you go, if I don't overcome that, that's going to cause me loss. That's a threat. That's going to cause me loss or harm not to overcome that. A challenge appraisal is when we go, if I overcome that, that's going to be of great benefit to me. And it's important. So one thing we did find, a really small finding, was that if intensity was high, the intensity of the stressor was really high, it was more likely to be a threat. But that finding, we need to do more work on that. The interesting takeaway for the appraisals is that performance stresses were more likely to be seen as a challenge. So when players were reporting that, yep, it's my performance, it's my play, it's the outcome, it's the performance of my performance in general, they saw that as a challenge. Players thought to themselves, if I overcome this, that's going to bring me great benefit. If I get better, if I time my flash better, if I'm a better team fighter, if I hold my angles better, improve my aim through aim training, that's a challenge. That's going to bring me benefit. On the flip side, and this is worrying, teammate stresses were more likely to be seen as a threat. i.e. if I don't overcome this, it's going to cause me loss or harm. Sports psychologists, team managers, this again highlights how important it is for us to talk to our players about the stress that is being caused by their teammates and help them work with it. Stress appraisals are threat appraisals in traditional sport are linked to maladaptive coping. Maladaptive coping is linked to decreased performance and decreased mental health. We need to better deal with teammate stresses. Coping. This is really, really interesting. So the elite players employ more problem-focused coping. This is good. In traditional sport, problem-focused coping has the highest coping effectiveness, and we'll talk about that in the next box, but problem-focused coping is employed more often by elite players in traditional sport, and it's more adaptive, or it's more effective more of the time. So seeing higher numbers of problem-focused coping, that's good. What is worrying is the high number of avoidance coping strategies. A lot of esports athletes are choosing to just not deal with their stress. And if you remember back in video 1, I said that avoidance coping can be good in the short term, i.e. between rounds of CSGO, I might get up and take a break, or between games of League of Legends when we're training, I might get up, walk around, eat something, take a break. But this study that we ran here was a longitudinal study. So this means that over the 87-day period of collecting stress and coping data, a lot of avoidance coping was collected. This is really worrying. This has, as I've already said, bad connotations for mental health and performance if done over the long term. Interestingly, emotion-focused coping was the least employed. Now, we don't know if they were the least employed because we have the least strategies, like as in esports athletes or e-athletes don't have a large repertoire of emotion-focused coping strategies, so they couldn't employ them. Or if that they just didn't think that they would be effective or useful. We don't know yet. That's future research that I plan to conduct. And lastly, moving on to coping effectiveness, we found something really, really interesting. A really interesting statistic emerged. Problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping strategies were reported as more effective than avoidance coping in competition, in training, and in solo training. That's interesting because in traditional sport, problem-focused coping appears to be king. Problem-focused coping in traditional sport is reported as more effective than emotion-focused and avoidance coping. In esports, it appears that emotion-focused coping appears to be effective. It appears to be effective at alleviating stress, and we don't know why yet. But if you're a sports psychologist and a player, listening to this right now, you need to be developing problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping strategies because they appear to be important in esports. Did I have anything else I wanted to say? I have a guess here as to why emotion-focused coping strategies might be more effective in esports than traditional sport, but this isn't backed in science. This is just my opinion, and you might be able to tell me in the comments if you agree or disagree, or why you think the ability to deal with emotions in esports is rated as so effective or as effective as problem-focused coping. I think it's because of the nature of esports. I think it's because so much of it is online, and so much of it is, and that's really different to traditional sport. I think we can't, if we're playing online, we're not playing in the same room as our team. We can't, sit them down, pull them away for a one-on-one meeting and go, that's really annoying me. I think it's more important in esport to be able to recognize something someone else has done has just caused me a series of negative emotions, but I'm able to deal with that. I can cope with those emotions in using my various strategies. I think that could be contributing to emotion-focused coping being reported by these elite e-athletes as being more effective, as effective as problem-focused coping and more effective than avoidance coping. But let me know why you think we found that result. I'm really interested to hear. So, a summary of the findings for study 2. We found, similar to traditional sport, we found an increased stressor frequency around important competitions. So as the competition got closer and during the competition, players reported more sources of stress. If you're a sports psychologist, if you're a team owner or a team org, and you only get a few chances to hire a sports psychologist or work with your players, bring them in around competitions. This is when players are reporting the most sources of stress. Similar to study 1, similar categories were reported between esports and traditional sports athletes. So there's a good overlap. We can lean on the sports psychology literature to help inform how we're working with our e-athletes. Problem-focused coping was the most frequently employed strategy, and problem-focused coping was reported as being effective. They are all similar to traditional sport. What were the major differences? Novel stresses were reported in study 1, were reported again in study 2. So that kind of helps confirm that esports athletes experience the same but also different stresses to traditional sports athletes. Challenge and threat perceptions were not related to stresses. So that's probably going to be more interesting to the sports psychologist listening. We don't yet know what stresses, lower order stresses, are causing threat or challenge perceptions. That's research I hope to do in the future. Most importantly, in my opinion, and most interestingly, in my opinion, was that emotion-focused coping was reported as being effective, more effective in esports. We need to help our players develop emotion-focused coping strategies. If you're a player listening to this, you need to develop problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping strategies. And as I touched on in video 1, my esports coping effectiveness training that I'm working on now, that I'm running in a few weeks with a high-performing team, helps players build both of those coping strategies. So this is where we are in the video series. We've talked about what is stress, we've talked about the sources of stress, and we've talked about the whole stress and coping process. In video 4, the next video, we're going to talk about mental toughness. Last video, we're going to talk about the psychology of elite e-athletes. If you have any questions, if you need clarification on anything I spoke about, email me, hit me up on Twitter, or leave a comment in the video below. Thank you for getting this far.